ask Patrycja, thank you, to give me the microphone and just tell you 2-3 things which I think are really important for takeaways when we look at the global outlook track. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to start by telling you that really, we live in an incredibly dynamically changing time, that the challenges we face are the greatest since the end of the Cold War. But it sounds more and more like a cliche. I mean, we have been saying the same thing for the last 4 years. I think a big takeaway, and that's the first thing I want to tell you, coming from the last year's Warsaw Security Forum, is that we're already beyond recognizing this reality is here. This is our new reality. We simply need to step up, recognize it, and start acting into it the best way with policy responses that we can produce and create. Now, there are so many important subjects we're touching on this Warsaw Security Forum, looking at the global outlook track, from Brexit through the situation in the Middle East, which we'll talk about in a second, into the global superpower rivalry, which is accelerating, and we're trying to figure out what this will mean for the region, what it will mean for Europe. But again, it's the last 2 years, it's accelerated so much that we're already in this new reality. So the message number 2 coming from here is that we should start really proactively building up the policy responses, not thinking, over-analyzing where we are, but actually working together on trying to find concrete ideas and take concrete actions. And this is a very strong and important message that we want to pass through to all of our panels, so that the participants asking their questions, so that the panelists giving their answers will propose interesting concepts, will propose concrete actions, will sort of get over, recognizing the realities, but coming to very forward-looking and very tangible, concrete ideas. And the third point, coming again from reflecting on the last year's Warsaw Security Forum, on other meetings and conferences, is that within all of this new that is coming our way, we're not toothless, we're not defenseless. We've got an incredibly robust and strong system of alliances and of institutions, and we need to protect it. We cannot take it for granted. We have the tools that we need to build on, and I think enough discussions about their relevance. More and more, how do we use them to find ourselves as the community of democracies, if I can use this term, to respond to those challenges. And this is the third sort of observation coming here from the discussions last year in the Global Outlook track, that we want to encourage everybody to filter their responses, to filter their thoughts through, so that we can look at the concrete actions. There is a saying, "May you live in interesting times," which is apparently hails from a Chinese curse. Very important sign of times. Well, they are here for us, and we here at the community gathered at the Warsaw Security Forum really have the brain power, have the connections, and have the opportunities to come together to come up with suggestions. So I really hope that you will find the spaces for discussions, producing some concrete ideas, and take them with you for the next steps within the EU, within the transatlantic community, within other fora, because if we don't step up at this time, nobody will. And I think it's an incredibly important message that we here at the Warsaw Security Forum want to project. So I tried to be very brief with my much longer speech, and I'm very happy to present now the next panel with our fabulous participants and the great moderator, Patrycja Sasnal from the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Patrycja, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks. You will allow me to remain seated. This panel is on the deadlock, Iran, the United States, and the Middle East. Now, you encouraged us to look for policy responses in the case of Iran, the United States, and the Middle East. it's enough, I think, to analyze policy responses that we have seen so far. It's already a challenging task in itself. My name is Patrycja Sasnal. I'm the head of research at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. We are the co-organizer of this panel, and I'm very happy to be here and present to you a really fabulous panel that we have to talk about the deadlock between Iran and the United States and in general in the Middle East. To my furthest left is Ellie Geranmayeh. She's the Deputy Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Ellie specializes in European foreign policy vis-à-vis Iran, particularly on Iranian nuclear and regional dossier, but also on the sanctions policy. Ellie comments very often in mainstream media. She's seen on CNN, BBC. She wrote or was quoted by The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times. Ellie, we're happy to have you here. Now, a little bit closer to me, but also to the left, is Dan Fried. Dan needs no introduction in this city. Dan was the ambassador of the United States to Poland, and has been, throughout his 40-year career, an advocate of Poland, Polish accession to NATO and Western structures. But also, Dan was the ambassador and served as the State Department's first special envoy for the closure of Guantanamo. He established procedures for the transfer of individual detainees and negotiated the transfer of 70 detainees to 20 countries with improved security outcomes. Now, I'm saying this because there's a linkage to the Middle East with that capacity that you served in, Dan, isn't there? So we're happy to have you. And to my immediate left is Alberto Fernandez. Alberto is the president of the Middle East Broadcasting Network. The MBN oversees very important media outlets. Al Hurra, which is an American-sponsored television in Arabic that has a growing popularity in the Middle East. And MBN also oversees the radio that's called Sawa, which means together, and it's also quite popular, especially among the young, as I am aware. But Alberto was also vice president of the Middle East Media Research Institute, MEMRI. To all of you who cover or have done anything on or in the Middle East, you're probably familiar with MEMRI. So welcome. Now, I think it's always good to go to the dictionary from time to time. And I checked the word deadlock. And the definition of deadlock is a state, this is according to Oxford Dictionary, is a state in which progress is impossible. And I want to ask all of you for your introductory round, is progress impossible in the relations between Iran and the United States? Ellie, can we start with you?
Sure, good afternoon, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me here. So, I've just come from New York last week, where there was a lot of shuttle diplomacy happening between Iran, the United States, via European intermediaries. And I come from a background where I watched the progress around the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, something that seemed very impossible at the time, and yet breakthroughs were possible with enough genuine diplomatic weight put behind it by both Tehran and Washington. Now, obviously, the diplomatic push that President Macron hoped to see through last week between Tehran and Washington didn't transpire as planned. And I think it points to a real problem that we have at the moment in the Iran-US dynamic, in that both sides are still busy accumulating leverage points, and neither side seems to want to use the position of strength that they have gained through current escalation that we've seen in the past year to make the first step to de-escalate. And the problem that was really faced, I think, by the French diplomatic effort last week was that on the one hand, the Iranian side wasn't prepared to give away perhaps its main political bargaining chip, which is this meeting, high-profile meeting or telephone conversation with the US president. And the US side wasn't willing to even ease any of the restrictions in its sanctions policy to allow for a European credit line to go through as part of an economic package to Iran to return Iran into full compliance with the nuclear deal and perhaps open the pathway for direct negotiations with the United States. So in short, the answer to your question is I do think that a political breakthrough is possible, even under the difficult conditions of a US maximum pressure policy.
And under this administration?
I would say even under this administration, it is possible, but in my opinion, we need to see some genuine signals from the US side that they are interested in a diplomatic effort. And that requires much more than just photo ops and high-profile pageantry. It requires concrete actions and signals which Iran can take away as genuine signs that really entering this diplomatic pathway with the Trump administration can be worthwhile.
Thanks. Dan, what's your take on that?
I basically agree with that summary of where we are. What strikes me about the US administration, which was your last question, is that President Trump has been inconsistently, but occasionally the most forthcoming senior American official. So John Bolton was insisting on regime change, more or less. And Pompeo Secretary of State Pompeo had his list of 12 demands from the Iranians. President Trump was talking about depriving Iran of a nuclear weapons capability. He said, that's what we want. It was the least ambitious, most attainable, most workable of any of his own administration's people defining what it is we want from Iran. And Macron's four-point package seemed designed to try to capture what the Americans want and put it into a context that the Iranians could accept. It failed, but if it weren't for the exciting American domestic political developments of the last week, we would have been hearing a lot more about what was really a near-miss breakthrough. It didn't work out, but it got close. And you could see the elements of a package developing, that the problems were timing, wording, sequencing, but not an impossibility of movement. Now, I know this sounds wildly optimistic to talk about the Trump administration having some breakthrough that goes beyond Obama and the JCPOA. But I watched the Bush administration do an about-face about the EU 3+3 because Chirac and Bush made a handshake deal over dinner in 2005. And France is the country to actually broker this because France has been consistently tough on Iran. And so they have the institutional credibility. Now, that's not to say that good news is going to happen, but that wasn't your question. Your question is it a deadlock? Look, Israel-Palestine is a deadlock at the moment, right? I can't figure out a way to make progress. But on Iran, sure. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is this administration has difficulty with policy discipline. And to actually get from here to there, you need not only the president's ambition, his desire for a big deal and drama, and his ability to flip policy, all of which can be good things. You also need the Obama administration's policy discipline. The way Bill Burns went out and met secretly with the Iranians in Oman. And everybody kept their mouths shut for a long time. If the Trump administration can do that, and look, Brian Hook, the administration's point person, on Iran, he's a capable guy. A week ago, I would have said he's as good as Kurt Volker. and maybe he is, much good will it do him. But he's a serious person. So, you know, as someone who professionally tried to find solutions rather than simply outline why it's impossible, it's not a deadlock. There is a way forward. The politics, dynamics, atmospherics are all lining up against it. But what Macron was trying to do is serious. And I think Brian Hook, if he's got the backing, and if President Trump's desire to change the subject from the current politics in Washington is dispositive, he might decide to give something like Macron's formula a chance. Look, it's not pretty and it's not pure, but that's where I come out, you know, it's not a deadlock.
Great. Alberto, is your opinion the same?
I think my opinion is a little different. I mean, on the bigger picture, of course, progress is always possible, and progress is possible now. I think the current administration was absolutely right in holding the JCPOA up to a negative light. It was a disastrous deal that helped strengthen Iran in the region, and they were right to walk away from it the way they did. The challenge is, I think, actually a little bit on what you talk about, is kind of the follow-through. The maximum pressure campaign, okay, that makes sense. But what after that? My concern is not so much that progress is possible, is that there's a danger, I think, of precipitous progress. We actually saw this in 2014, 2015, before the JCPOA, and there was this internal controversy in the American administration about including missiles and a question of regional security and all of these issues. And again, at the end it was decided, that's too complicated, we'll never get a deal, we have to simplify it, we will leave those things for later, or whatever kind of fig leaf was used at the time to cover that. So the deal that was arrived at in 2015 was, in a sense, we gave in, or the multilateral sanctions and the kind of consensus that existed gave in too soon to Iran and allowed them to be in a very favorable position. My concern is a little bit of what Dan says, is that we have this pressure campaign. It is having some effect. But it could very easily lead to a situation where you agree too soon to something, to basically agree to talk or agree to something which is narrowly defined. I mean, we had, I think, an extraordinary statement, admission from the EU3 just a few days ago, where they talked about reopening negotiations, and they talked about reopening negotiations, including what? Regional security and missiles. Really? You mean that wasn't dealt with in 2015? 4 years of wasted time and effort? It's an extraordinary admission, not by the Americans, but by the EU3, that there was a problem at the beginning of the JCPOA. So the challenge is, and I share this with Ambassador Fried's point, does the administration have the ability to take where they are right on the macro, they are right on their skepticism about the JCPOA, they were right about the power that unilateral sanctions could have, a kind of maximum escalation. They were right about that. But the third part of that, which is if we do this, how do we seal this, this situation up? Where do we go? That is the part where there's lack of clarity, and that is the part where the confusion which you refer to, which is, is it 14 points, is it 3 points, is it 1 point? That's the danger. So my fear actually is, while we all want some kind of progress, while we all want a definitive solution, we could fail at the last moment, as I would say we failed in 2015. And there is a deadlock in the region, but the deadlock that exists in the region is growing Iranian hegemony, which has flourished because of policy decisions made by the last two previous administrations, last two previous American administrations, a Republican administration and a Democratic administration, which allowed Iran to grow in strength. At the end of the day, there's a problem, and my sense is the problem is that a state which is based and a government which is based on the concept of wilayat al-faqih is at the end of the day incompatible with regional and global peace and security.
Okay. Can I ask you another follow-up question there? Could you unpack to us how the maximum pressure policy of this this administration is bringing good results? Because not only is Iran strong in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, like it was before the United States withdrew from the JCPOA, but it is also now organizing, we think they are doing this, attacks in the Gulf of Oman, in the Strait of Hormuz. They attacked, probably, the territory of Saudi Arabia. So how is this policy bringing good results?
Well, it's I think, something that was absolutely had to be expected, that as the sanctions bit, the Iranians would believe, rightly from their point of view, that you have to kind of wage a kind of asymmetrical act of political, military, intelligence, jujitsu to try to reset the clock or reset the agenda, to try to, for example, separate the Americans from the Europeans more than they're separated, to try, for example, to weaken those Arab states that are allied to the United States. That's why you see the focus on Saudi Arabia. That's why you see these messages about, Dubai and Abu Dhabi and the desalination plants of the Gulf are very fragile. They are in this box, they're in this sanctions box, and they're seeking to find a way out of it. And the way out of it is, and they've said it in, leaders in the IRGC have said it, seek to kind of manage this escalation strategy, which is one that involves violence, one that involves terrorism, one that involves many things, but is just short of outright war, because they actually don't want outright war. They want this kind of gray situation where they indirectly use and sometimes directly use different tools that they have to try to change the situation where they're in.
Ellie, I'm curious about your response to what Alberto said. I guess us Europeans, we shudder at the notion that JCPOA was a disastrous deal. So without maybe going into the details on why the JCPOA was not such a disastrous deal, but if you could give us your assessment of the US administration tactic vis-a-vis Iran, but also about internal Iranian thinking about this current conflict and the goals of Iran. What does Iran want to achieve with what happened since May this year?
Sure, I'll start off with a few responses. So again, I was in DC last week. There was a lot being made about this E3 statement that came out earlier in the week. I just wanted to unpack that because, first of all, this is not the first time that the E3 has denounced Iran for being a problematic actor in the region. We had a EU 28 member state consensus on this issue in January of this year, when far more European countries came out to condemn Iran. So there is this perception inside Washington that just because Europe backs the nuclear deal and diplomacy with Iran, somehow they are to shy away from condemning Iran or dealing with thorny issues with Iran. But I think the main difference is that the Europeans believe that a diplomatic pathway is going to be the simplest way to resolve this crisis with Iran rather than the maximum pressure campaign. And regarding the nuclear deal itself, I mean, my sense with talking to European capitals is that the real spirit of the deal was never able to fulfill itself because of the way US politics panned out. So just as a very quick timeline, the deal came into effect in January 2016, and by November of that year, you had a US president elected that vowed to tear up the disastrous, quote-unquote, nuclear deal. And so the deal never really had time to bear fruit in the way that those who were parties to it were hoping to do. And the E3 worked very hard with Brian Hook's team for several months to come up with a new package of discussions. They never claimed that the regional security element or Iran's missiles shouldn't be dealt with. In fact, it was the French who were the most insistent on dealing with this issue. And by the way, some would argue that the French are still even more insistent than the Trump administration to deal with this issue, by the way. But at the end of the day, Trump wanted to walk away from this deal because it was an Obama deal. Let's just face it. I mean, he wants a Trump banner, perhaps under even the same contours of the deal that we had before. Regarding what's happening on Iran's internal thinking, the one point I do agree with the last comment is that Iran is now escalating in the hope of de-escalation. But let's remember that when the maximum pressure campaign was being unveiled, this was being unveiled as a tactic to bring Iran to its knees, to bring Iran begging to the negotiation table, to crumble Iran's economy. I remember being in meetings where people were with US administration folks claiming that Iran's economy would cripple within months, within 3 months. And at the moment, we're at a stage where the Iranian government is boasting that it has managed to stabilize the currency, that it can outlive the Trump administration potentially, at least the next year until the US elections become more clear. And to my mind, if we don't have creativity and backing to some sort of a arrangement, a formula that President Macron has pushed, and by the way, is still hoping to push, regardless of last week, we're going to see far more flashpoints in the region. And I think the Iranian thinking is if Tehran has to pay a cost because of the maximum pressure campaign, if Tehran has to lose valuable market share in the energy sector, then all the regional actors are going to pay a cost for that. And right now, when Iran feels that it has a position of strength in the region, where it has its network of alliances in Iraq, in Lebanon, new alliances in places like Yemen because of the conflict that we've seen in the last 5 years there. It has much more cards to play now than perhaps in 10 years' time. And so right now, I think it's about changing the calculations of the US administration, particularly the Trump administration as it goes up to election seasons, to put forward a choice between diplomacy or potentially military confrontation.
Could you tell us also why Iran struck those oil installations in Saudi Arabia, if it was Iran?
So I would say whoever orchestrated those attacks was sending a very clear signal that everybody in the region is going to pay a cost from what we're seeing unfold as a result of the US maximum pressure campaign on Iran. And you could argue it's been a very effective warning shot. The UAE, we've seen slightly moderate its position in the way that it has come out in the aftermath of the attacks in May. There's been several delegations from the UAE sent to Iran to discuss potential areas of de-escalation. The latest statement from the Saudi kingdom also indicates that they are interested in some sort of a de-escalation pathway, because I think there is this recognition now, perhaps from the regional actors predominantly, that they can't guarantee that the US administration is going to come in and provide a safety net for them. And so they themselves have to look for some sort of a de-escalation pathway with Iran, especially as their own vulnerabilities to potential attacks become more and more evident.
Dan, if we brought in this Saudi Arabia and Israel and the larger regional picture, do you think Trump administration is under pressure from local actors, local regional actors, to behave in a certain way vis-à-vis Iran?
Well, I think it's fairly clear that Netanyahu likes a degree of tension and didn't like the JCPOA. That's fairly clear. Saudi Arabia's position is also fairly clear, which is why Iran was sending a signal to them, and I assume it was Iran that is behind the attack. I can't imagine otherwise. Look, I want to go back to something about maximum pressure and sanctions, because my last job in government was the head of the State Department's sanctions policy unit. Sanctions are not a policy. They are a tool to advance a policy. Maximum pressure for what? And if you can't answer that question, what are you doing? I don't think the JCPOA was such a disaster. I think it was limited. You know, the JCPOA is like arms control with the Soviet Union. It's not going to solve the Cold War, which was not an arms control dilemma. It might stabilize certain aspects of the Cold War. Now you have Rouhani in New York last week, and this kind of got buried, suggesting that under certain circumstances, Iran could go beyond the JCPOA. It wasn't the final word. The Trump administration is going to have to decide what it wants. And and there is also a danger that Trump will do with Iran what he was doing with North Korea, which is suddenly leap ahead and accept some flimsy deal that would not satisfy the French. So he could go from being uber hardline to caving and get the French coming at him from the right or from a harder line position, in which case my sympathy would be with the French. But if the Trump administration could actually exercise the policy discipline, there's a way forward putting these things together. It will have to include an aspect of Iran's regional development, regional malign activities, ballistic missiles, and then the United States should not forget that at least we used to have one enormous asset, which is that a large part of Iranian society actually liked the United States, which is an asset. It's an asset which, if you've got it, you should not squander. I mean, for God's sakes, why don't we have in Tehran an interest section? A bunch of people able to go out and at least, under difficult circumstances, reach out to Iranian society. I know that that sounds impossible, but hey, I served as a junior diplomat in the Soviet Union in the Brezhnev era. And we were able to actually talk to Soviets. It makes a difference. With all of those assets, I don't fear some kind of a deal with Iran would be the end of the world. And sanctions can do many things, but one thing they cannot do is get the other guy to surrender completely. That is not going to happen. You know, maximum pressure, this or that, but the United States is going to have to stop allowing various anti-Iranian lobbying groups to write our ultimate policy. I'm not knocking the lobbying groups. That's their conviction. That's their job. Let them go ahead and push for it. But in government, your job is not to let somebody else write your points just so they'll be nice to you, on Fox News. All right? Your job is to figure out what's doable and go out and achieve it. And I think the good news is there's something there. And the characterization of the Europeans as feckless and weak is just, stop, save that stuff for, for domestic politics, because it's, the Europeans would be perfectly willing to work with us on something achievable, I'm confident.
Super. We'll open it up to the audience now. So please raise your hands if you want to ask questions to the panelists. Yeah, we already have a gentleman here, a lady here, and a gentleman over there. Sure. Just a second, it's coming. The mic's coming.
Jonathan Isle from the Royal United Services Institute in London. I'm interested in this concept, which sounds very nice, and it's sort of a social science talk of de-escalation pathway. What does it actually mean in practice? One, do we believe that if a completely different president is in the White House on the 1st of January or in January 2021, the JCPOA could simply be recreated after what has happened? If we don't, what kind of a deal can be done? What would be the incentive of Iran, having survived this pressure, to give up its ballistic missile program, or its drone program, or indeed its nuclear program? Would it get out of Syria? Would it get out of Iraq? Would it get out of the Houthis in Yemen? So what is this de-escalation pathway, which sounds very nice, apart from a situation of today with some acceptance that Iran's stakes up to now have been confirmed and that Tehran can keep all these stakes?
Thank you. We'll take 3 and then go back to the panel. The lady there.
Hi, everyone. Alexandra Szokiewicz, control risk, political risk analyst. I have 2 quick questions, actually. The first one is, when the British flag vessel Stena Imperial was detained, the European signatories of the deal kind of stayed clear of aligning with the US on joining their maritime mission in the Strait of Hormuz. And as the pressure rises now sort of on the E3 to act on what is perceived as Iranian sort of actions of provocation, how will this impact how will these tensions impact sort of the relationship between the EU, or more specifically the E3, and the US? And then the second question is, what is the prospect for the EU to reimpose sanctions on Iran, and what exactly concretely would trigger that? Thank you.
To reimpose sanctions?
Yes,
is
to
what you
impose
said?
sanctions on Iran. Yep.
Right. Well, some
Thank
are
you.
imposed. And the gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much. Alexei Kolominets, the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies, Kyiv, Ukraine. For me and for many of my colleagues in Ukraine, there is no doubt that both Iranian nuclear deal, as well as the so-called Minsk Accords, are the most dangerous, the most horrific deals in the history, as President Trump has absolutely rightly said many, many times. Those deals have a huge efforts, first for Iran and for his allies. First of all, the Putin regime, to create the union, not the alliance, the union between Moscow, Tehran, Damascus, Hezbollah, and probably Syria.
So we have 8 minutes, so you need to answer the question.
Yes, I'm sorry. And a huge weapons and money channeled to the eastern part of Ukraine, strengthening bandits in Ukraine. The very parallel process unfolding from the beginning of the signing Minsk agreement and the Iranian deal. My questions is, first of all, a senior from the USA, thank you for your comments. I absolutely agree with you. What do you expect personally from Trump to save his second victory after the 1 year from now? And the second one, for the all.
So please just repeat the question that you had. We didn't get that, and we'll go to the panel, okay? So just repeat the question.
And please, what do you wait for Trump personally?
Would you rate for
with
Trump?
his strategy against Iran to save his second victory? And the second question.
Thank you, sir. We don't have much more time. We have 7 minutes. We need to go back to the panel, and then we'll go back to the audience. Okay, so just, do you want to respond to the questions that we had so far? So what's the de-escalation path, chances for JCPOA returning, and the impact on transatlantic relations?
I don't use the phrase, I would prefer not to use the phrase de-escalation, because that is not an objective. The objective is to deal with the shortcomings of the JCPOA and to deal with Iran's malign behavior in the regime, and to use the JCPOA, the prospect of additional sanctions or sanctions relief as tools to those ends. So I think what a better future, a better immediate future looks like is by taking the elements of the Macron 4-point plan and actually getting more out of the Iranians than was possible with the JCPOA. Macron thinks that's possible. I suspect the Iranians would be willing to do it. The question is sequencing and confidence that Trump is going to actually hold up his end of the bargain.
Anybody wants to answer the question about transatlantic relations and the Iranian issue?
I just want to actually answer this question again, if I may. I actually do believe the Europeans are pursuing de-escalation because it's about putting out some of the fires that the maximum pressure campaign has created. And the best place where they're trying to do this is on the JCPOA itself. So we've seen now Iran escalating on the nuclear file through phased non-compliance with the nuclear agreement. And part of the Macron plan has been in return for a certain degree of relief from the US sanctions for Iran to come back into full compliance with the JCPOA, because at least you don't have to deal with that crisis looming ahead. I do think that there's a difference between finding a compromise and asking Iran to surrender. You're not going to get Iran to pack up its ballistic missile program. You're not going to get Iran to pack up its nuclear program. But what you can do is find compromises around that. And here, as the Iranian officials have said, if you want more, you've got to pay more. So they are actually looking for a more for more deal because, let's face it, even for Iran, under Obama, the JCPOA was not planning out the way they thought it was in terms of sanctions easing, particularly access to the US dollar. So if there is going to be some sort of a grand bargain, which I'm myself quite skeptical about, the Iranians themselves will want to have some more extensive sanctions relief from the US side, which ensures that they can economically re-engage the global markets in the way they were not able to before. On the transatlantic tensions, look, I think that what happened around Stena Impero and the E3 decision-making around that is a result of the fact, in my opinion, in my interpretation, that the UK didn't coordinate its action on the detention of Grace 1 with other European countries, and that itself created a series of, I think, political difficulties around that. The same issue with getting together even a European maritime mission at the moment. There's a lot of concern that once you involve yourself in a maritime security mission in the Strait of Hormuz, you're going to be directly linked to a US-led mission. It becomes very difficult to not coordinate those two efforts. And I think at the moment, the Europeans do want to deal with Iran, but they don't necessarily want to do it through a US prism. And this is the tension. And on that point, right now, I don't see any EU consensus over sanctions policy on Iran. Where that might come about is if the JCPOA collapses and you get a snapback of EU sanctions.
We'll take 3 last questions. The gentleman here in the up front, and 2, oh, sorry. Okay, 4 questions then.
Well, thank you very much for our panelists for their different views. As an immediate neighbor to Iran, I'm ambassador of Armenia. You sure understand, and Dan Fried knows very well, you know, because he personally has been involved for a long time. We have an extreme difficulty to understand the assertion of the unequivocal destructive role of Iran in the region, because in our relationship with Iran, we witness a different path and a different sort of kind of content of relationship. And by the way, the president of Iran was in Yerevan, in the capital of Armenia, yesterday and the day before yesterday. We also we have been supporting, we continue to support the JCPOA. Because as Dan Friedman mentioned, any agreement of that scope and kind is never perfect. You know, that kind of agreements do have their limitations, but you need to enter into the play in order to increase at a later stage from the benefits of on both sides and to extend the boundaries of such agreements. So we will continue to insist on the preservation of that agreement, and probably if it will be the case, then through showing more engagement and through showing more benefits to the Iranian side, it will be possible in the future to renegotiate, to expand the scope of the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. So that was a remark. Thanks. The two gentlemen over there and here in the first row, and we're done.
Thank you. Very short. Patrycja is Director of Energy Security Center of Excellence. And just to clarify on this de-escalation thing, so energy crisis didn't happen, I mean after attacks. Energy crisis didn't happen. Everybody in the region is scared of Iran, according to what I hear from you. We have new type of warfare almost introduced. There is no attribution. We cannot say clearly that that was Iran. There was a guy on the TV in the tracksuit claiming that he's responsible. Non-attribution. Everybody's scared in the region. Iran is happy. Only United States has no response, and we're saying this is good. Do I understand it clearly? That's what we want. That's the result we wanted. That's how we de-escalate. Because, you know, it's my personal question. I just was asked to conduct the study in my institution, the security implications of what happened in Saudi Arabia. So I probably should cancel the study because everything is good.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman there.
Hello, my name is Geranmayeh. I'm coming from Greece, and I'm Director Research Institute for European American Studies. I want to address a question to Dr. Dania Friede. 2 weeks ago, the members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard criticized the Iranian regime that we don't have meat for our families. Is this kind of a concept or this idea because of the embargo? And my question is this: is the Iranian economic stability might escalate the Iranian proxies like Hezbollah or Hamas or any other group in Latin America in order to counterbalance the social demonstration and frustration that is underway? Thank you, sir.
Okay.
My name's Bobo Lowe. My question is for Dan Fried and Ellie Geranmayeh. Do you see any scope for a constructive Russian role in reaching a solution, or even scope for playing on incipient tensions between Moscow and Tehran?
Thank you. Okay, so we're back to the panel, and for a final round of your answers and maybe final remarks. I just want to draw maybe on the gentleman from Greece question about the linkage between the situation of the within Iran and the Iranian economy and financing, Iranian financing for their proxies in the region. This, I guess, Ellie, maybe you'd want to answer that. Whether people are, whether the unhappiness of the Iranians with the financing of proxies may transpire in the form of internal unrest in Iran. Fernando, can we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, let me take on a couple of them mentioned, the region and the situation in the region. There's a price to pay. We sometimes in the West very easily forget it. When we talk about regional security, there's a real price that is being paid in the region for Iranian adventurism in the region. People in Europe are concerned about refugees. People in Europe are concerned about Salafi jihadism. A case can be made that Iranian aggression in the region made both of those issues which would have existed anyway, made them much worse. It's Iranian hegemony in the region. It's Iranian aggression in the region, as seen in this arc from Lebanon to Iraq and elsewhere, which has stoked the fires of sectarianism, which has stoked the fires of this kind of extreme reaction to Iran in the region. And we seem to forget that, The JCPOA, among other things, was built on the blood of 500,000 Syrians. There's a link between the disaster that is Syria, inside Syria and for the world, and with this agreement. And we sometimes very easily kind of forget that and glom off of that and think that. At the same time, people in the region are going to, even if they hate Iran, even if they have problems, deep problems with Iran, if they see, in fact, that the United States is not serious about its regional role, that the United States is, as some have said, that what we have under Trump is a kind of a right-wing version of American withdrawal from the region, as Obama was a left-wing version of kind of washing their hands and pivoting to Asia or whatever. People in the region, including our friends in the region, are going to make deals and do the best they can with an Iranian regime that is not going to go anywhere.
Thank you. Dan?
With respect to the Russian role, my expectations for Putin playing a positive role are under control. Don't rule it out, but don't expect too much. You want to work with somebody who can be helpful, work with Macron. Okay, I mean, the French know what they're doing in the region. With respect to the Saudis and the attack on the oil fields, that's clearly a sign that Iran is declaring its willingness to burn down the house. I'm glad that the administration did not follow with a military strike of its own. I suspect that we have found other ways to send messages to the Iranians. Right now, I think the task is to figure out the way to address the shortcomings of the JCPOA, expand the scope of limitations on and barriers to malign Iranian behavior, and figure out the sequencing of what we're willing to do for the Iranians. I mean, oil waivers. The advantage of oil waivers is that it gives the Iranians some cash, and then you can reimpose the barriers, because then they have to sell the next month. You can do it, you can cut off the favors if you're prepared to do that. So I'm not saying there's an easy solution or a clean solution, but no, on the list of 4 of big, tough foreign policy problems, this is in the category of hard but doable, as opposed to I don't even want to go near it.
Thanks, that's an optimistic note.
Sure, on the Russian role in the regional solution, as you may know, that the Russians are now proposing their own regional security architecture paper that's going around at the moment. It's not the first, it won't be the last. I think the Russians can be helpful on specific contexts. So obviously on the Syria file, the Russians can play a much more active role than the French can. On the US-Iran file, I think the French are prepared to act much more in the leadership role than we've seen any indication of from Putin being willing or having the appetite to do so. I think it will be on a case-by-case issue. And obviously, the Russians have developed a very interesting dynamic with Israel, Iran, the Turks, that no European or US interlocutor has managed to do. And so I think their role can be at least influential in the Syria context. I'm afraid I didn't catch some of the questions, but I'll try and respond to some of them. I think it's really important when you speak to interlocutors in Iran, they don't really see themselves as being purely just part of the Middle East. You have to remember Iran has 15 sea and land borders. They see themselves as having a role in the Caucasus. They see themselves being a partner on the border with Pakistan, Afghanistan. Some of these countries are exceptionally important to US interests beyond the Middle East, of course. And so I think Iran has to be taken into the broader context, particularly from a US policy perspective going beyond the Middle East. And on the question about Iran and the domestic link between the protests that we saw in late 2017, early 2018, look, I would say clearly that frustration on the economic side and on the domestic issue is there, but Iranians have been protesting about funding of groups, Palestinian groups, Hamas, for many decades now. And it still hasn't had a huge, significant implication on the foreign policy dynamic of Iran's government or the Iranian establishment. So I doubt it will do so much going forward. And by the way, since early 2018, we've been expecting protests, and of course with the Middle East, anything can happen at any point. But certainly that they've dwindled down, and they're not happening on the vast scale that we saw, despite the fact that the economy is under much more, I think, pain than it was in late 2017. And I just add one last point from a point that was made on whether if the Democrats come into the White House, will they just rejoin the JCPOA? There's a lot of discussion happening in the campaigns at the moment on this issue. Broadly, all of them have vowed to come back into the JCPOA, which is, by the way, one reason I don't think Iran will want to collapse the JCPOA altogether. I think they will want to keep an architecture in place for any US administration to return at least to some contours of it. But an interesting card that the Democrats could play is to say, we will rejoin, give sanctions easing, and we will give a certain time limit for negotiation on all these other issues. And if we don't see progress, we will reimpose US secondary sanctions. And one thing that we've seen from the experiment, for better or for worse, which I think is painful as a European to say, but US secondary sanctions have proven to be extremely powerful. You don't need the United Nations, you don't need the EU. So any future US presidency has a very powerful card to play, but they need to play it with a policy to actually open up a pathway for diplomacy and compromise to emerge with Iran. And so from that advantage, I do think Iran will need to see some sanctions easing to open the way for compromise on its end.
Okay. So in 15 minutes' time, we managed to come to the conclusion that perhaps it's not necessarily a deadlock. This, I guess, we can all subscribe to. Thank you very much. Ellie, Dan, Alberto, you've done a fantastic job. Thank you very much.